is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. It's lovely to be joining you from Gadigal country with a spring in my step.
And a song in your heart?
Yep, sort of. I'm trying to cover for, like we're at that time of year where you really do need a little bit of a break around winter. So it's, I can see the light towards a few days off at some point in a month. But that feels good to know that that's a thing that will happen. Yeah.
Great to have something to look forward to. We are also joined by a man who, after many adventures, is safely ensconced back in his home office, surrounded by his nerdy knickknacks. It is Tennant Reid. Good day, Tennant.
The knickknacks, they abide. Although they do rotate from time to time to keep things exciting for people on Teams or Zoom calls. Right now, we've got a Wizard staff, a Lego Dungeons & Dragons set, a Bob Hawke biography, The Prize by oil industry maven Daniel Jurgen, and the Masks of Nyarlathotep prop set for the day that may come, Luke, when an even longer and more all-embracing role-playing game campaign is called for than the mega dungeon that we are currently making our way through.
Well, given our campaign is, I think, about to clock up 3 years.
Yep.
That is a sobering thought indeed.
And maybe, if you squint at it, a quarter of the way through that dungeon.
I guess an insight for listeners that podcasts are not the only interminable activity that Tennant are involved in. On this week's show, Muscovich's Methane Musings moves to prime time as we take a look at a new consultation paper from the Climate Change Authority on the topic of fossil methane. But first, China has released its 15th five-year plan for the construction of a new energy system, and it is well worth a look, given the country's outsized impact on both global emissions and the clean energy supply chain. So, Tennant, what jumped out at you?
The 5-year plan is a thing that takes some understanding, and I will be upfront and say it takes more understanding than I believe I have, because I think about Australia's federal budget, the emissions reduction sector plans, the future gas strategy, a bunch of Australian documents that we are all and many listeners to this podcast will be somewhere between somewhat and very familiar with. Now think about trying to unpack the nuances of all of those things in a whole other country that you don't know anything near as much about as you do about Australia. Think about the various things that sound amazing or very authoritative in the budget, and they're like, oh, well, that's actually a guesstimate, or, oh, that's subject to negotiation with the Senate, or, oh, that's a re-announcement of something from 3 years ago, or whatever. We need to bear in mind all of that missing context when we look at either the overarching ultra-mega 5-year plan, which was released in March, the 15th 5-year plan for the period to 2030, or when we look at the more detailed sub-plans for different topics that have been coming out, and recently the energy and climate one. And so all the judgments and highlights that we're going to trundle through, I think we should have just a honking big asterisk on of, actually, it's quite hard to fully understand and fully contextualize this in the way that we would want to if we were looking at something local. All that extensive throat clearing in mind, what's in the plan is a mix of the seemingly impressive but actually very cautious and the quite new and big and interesting. And what it will actually lead to is anybody's guess, because there's a sort of a factor of where is there conservatism here in order to have plans that get beaten? Where are there like compromises here that are probably going to be overtaken by events? Where are there things that might not be achieved really? The headline things, so there is no dramatic acceleration in China's existing plans for either climate or energy. The 2030, as far before as possible, peaking date for emissions is still a part of this. There's no statement that we have already peaked, which many people have thought maybe China had peaked. Perhaps they will make that call at some point in the course of they have to actually, under the parameters of the plan, peak during the plan, but they may at some point say, oh yeah, we already did. But maybe that's in the 16th plan that they say very retrospectively that they did so. They have plans to bring non-fossil energy to a 25% share of total energy consumption by 2030. That's something that they're pretty well on course for anyway, especially given the quite rapid progress they've been making on electrification. There is a plan relevant, Luke, to some work that you guys at the Energy Efficiency Council have been up to your knees in, up to your necks in even, a plan for hitting 35% electrification of the economy by 2030. So well in advance of the 2035 target. There are plans for the deployment of a lot of wind and solar, but actually not as much, not as fast as they have been deploying in the last few years, and even allowing for a bit of a slowdown from like an individual year peak that was very unusual. Like it does strike people, observers like Lauri Bilaverta, a widely respected China energy watcher and translator of what it all means. Not very impressive numbers in the context of the like world historically epically impressive stuff that has actually been happening in China. The things that look more interesting are some of the elements around energy flexibility and distributed flexible energy resources. So they do intend to significantly lift the amount of distributed solar as the source of so much distributed solar for the rest of the world. It may surprise people to hear that there's not as common rooftop solar in Chinese households as there is by a long margin in Australia. But there is a plan to substantially raise the installation rate there. They intend to have 50 gigawatts of vehicle-to-grid capability by 2030 and 50 gigawatts of virtual power plants over the same period, and to lift to 450 gigawatts of new energy storage by 2030. And those are numbers that are both credible given the scale of China's EV industries and battery industries, but also like pretty interesting and transformative in the case of the storage, the start of a transformation in the case of the vehicle to grid. If they can approach those numbers, which are much more than they currently have, then that will be a massive demonstration and test bed for the rest of the world in those technologies. there's some good things in there. I think this is not, if we think back to the start of the year, or was it late last year? No, start of this year, the scenarios for climate geopolitics, the version of those scenarios where China makes a clear decision to be not just the seller of clean tech to the world, but the leader in raising and softly enforcing higher ambition. Well, that's not happening here. They are continuing to be pioneers and the workshop of the world for clean tech. They are continuing a large transformation, but being careful in the process rather than radically raising ambition at this point, is how it looked to me. How did it look to you two?
I mean, the pivot, as it looks to be, around focusing more on distributed generation and flexibility, is that countered by, or any sort of change in where the projected growth in large-scale renewables was to be compared to last time? Because one of the interesting things that we've sort of looked at without going into too much detail is, like, when does China start to come up against, you know, where the most low-hanging fruit in their kind of cost curve for rollout of large-scale stuff would happen? The question I would have is this maybe a bit of a response to that, potentially? I don't have that answer, but it's an interesting pivot to sort of contrast the not so ambitious targets on the power sector in terms of large-scale stuff, with a much stronger focus on the distributed piece. And one thing you could maybe read into that is that it might be, like, just from a cost-effectiveness perspective, like maybe that's where the bigger efficiencies might be got. But that's just like a follow-up question I have. And the other thing to say is, like how closely have China tracked to these plans in the past? Because the usual refrain is, well, they're not going to put something in a plan until they do it, and then they'll talk about it later, which feels like a bit of a lazy thing to say here, but does seem to be the way that they sort of show up, is to do the thing first. And then talk about it, rather than project a huge amount of ambition in these sorts of plans.
So more wheels within wheels here, because the statements that what China commits to in the international arena through the nationally determined contributions and other pledges that it may enter into, that is definitely an arena for under-promise and over-deliver. The status of the 5-year plan is sort of, in theory, is this is the top level of the Chinese government telling all the other bits of it what you must do, what is expected of you. And so if again, on that theory, if they under-promise in that, they may well under-deliver, or will just like scrape through to delivering that. But it isn't just like telling everybody what's going to be done. Like this is not solely a grand strategy statement from a Olympian ultimate bureaucracy. It's a product of fights between different interests and tendencies within China, and like messy political compromises, and like all sorts of things are going on, including in the larger scale document on like the whole of China's plans for the next 5 years. Are they going to be able to hit, and by what means, the politically determined GDP growth targets that they've still got, and whether they, like how they perform on that, actually will wind up being extremely significant for some of these energy targets. Energy intensity of GDP and carbon intensity of GDP targets, how those go, is greatly affected by, is growth slower, and also by is there an effort to juice growth with emissions-intensive infrastructure stimulus, as we've seen many times over the past 20 years? Or does China succeed in doing the big change to a higher consumption, lower savings and investment economy that is like more servicey, less focused on these highly energy and emissions intensive activities? And like those things are, like many observers would say, the official plans on those GDP rebalancing issues are all like fudges and don't really make sense and are being pursued in ways that are contradictory. And yeah, so I think we need to get away from idolizing Chinese policymakers' view or the diabolizing Chinese policymakers' view. They're just like fumbling their way through, hoping somebody else will be in charge when the really tough decisions finally need to be made.
The people that I've been talking to that know a whole heap more about Chinese energy policy than I do, kind of the vibe is that they'd be surprised if renewable rollout slowed down to the degree that is set out in these projections. That seems kind of implausible. Some of the targets a stretch to even call them a target, like the electrification rate they've basically drawn a straight line to 2030, assuming a pretty similar rate of percentage increase in electrification that has been sent over the last 5 years to 2030. So more of a projection, really, than a target, potentially. I am super fascinated by the inclusion of sort of an explicit focus on flexibility. So investment in distribution networks, VPPs, as you say, vehicle to grid. It feels like if this plan is realised, it could be in China in the next 5 years that a lot of these sources of flexibility that not just in Australia but around the world have been identified as really absolutely crucial to managing cost and upping network utilisation as we electrify our economy, like it'll start to be properly proved up at some sort of scale. And so taking it from something that's, kind of theoretical and exciting to something which is actually utilised on a daily basis in the real world, that would be quite an interesting contribution, and could see a rapid evolution in both the technology associated with that, the software platforms associated with that, and also just how integrated it is into the products that are available that we are sourcing from China. So definitely one to watch.
You'd have to think the sort of state level control of the grid over there would provide in a way, like the sort of perfect stage for a very, very quick acceleration on the smarts and the tech around kind of grid control and stuff like that, right? Could easily overtake us and other countries that have been dabbling in that for longer, but maybe struggling to pick up the pace or the momentum to a certain scale.
One thing that's worth noting, the emphasis in both the text and the targets on flexibility and regulating, capacity to regulate the grid is inclusive of coal generation. And there is emphasis on transitioning thermal generation more into a responsive and grid regulation role rather than bulk power supply, which the utilisation rate of the Chinese coal fleet has been falling even as they've been adding more and newer coal plants, that they are performing more of the role that we've expected from gas generation in Australia. And the top level targets for regulation capacity are inclusive of coal power and clean sources of flexibility And so exactly how that all plays out, there's some vagueness in the, or at least interpretability in the way that the top level targets have been described so far. Presumably there will be a lot of argy-bargy over which techs fill which portion of that foreseen need.
All right. One to watch. Shall we chat about a report?
I think we must.
Let's gas bag.
Can't wait.
When it comes to global warming, not all greenhouse gases are created equal, and methane is a particularly potent perpetrator. While methane is short-lived compared to carbon dioxide, it traps much more heat, making it a big contributor to near-term warming. That should provide a powerful motivation for driving down methane emissions. But is Australia's existing suite of climate policies up to the task? That is the question explored in a new consultation paper from the Climate Change Authority titled Fossil Methane, a Near-Term Abatement Opportunity. In it, the CCA makes the case for increased policy focus on the methane generated by the coal, oil and gas sectors, explores why less methane abatement is occurring than might be expected, and asks if policy reforms, including through the upcoming Safeguard Mechanism review, could provide an opportunity to sharpen the incentive to curb methane emissions. So, Frankie, as the podcast resident methane head, just how excited were you to crack open this consultation paper?
Like, so excited.
I'm just going to sit over here sipping my cup of tea and letting you run the next 25 minutes.
Yeah, that's
this is going to be very relaxing for me.
Settle back, guys. No, I mean,
Let the methane wash over you.
I think we need some better singers on this. This is part of methane's problem. I was very excited and commend the CCA for really opening up this discussion. I think it's fair to say that there has been this kind of roiling, acknowledgement in various places, certainly in the investor community that I speak to regularly, but also more broadly in the environment movement, that there's a lot of opportunity here, but it's also kind of very fragmented and feels a bit disconnected across different sectors. And the kind of narrative cut through hasn't been there, I think, in as compelling a fashion as, kind of big campaigns we've seen take off recently, for example, around electrification. But this is not dealing with the flip side of that. It's sort of seeking to address these sorts of submissions where electrification, is not necessarily a solution in the box. And so you need to think about other things that might happen here. I'd say, just sort of sticking with that global context for a second there, long-time Summerupperers would know that I've been following and passionate about this issue for a long time. And a little while back, I actually think around the Dubai COP, there was some really good work that was being spearheaded by the Biden administration on methane. They'd made it a real focus, and there was this kind of global discussion sort of happening there.
That was the methane pledge, right?
Yeah, totally. So that's where the global methane pledge came through, but much of it was also grounded in very sensible places where you would start by improving the accuracy and kind of measurement methodologies and reporting around methane. So even just sort of really starting from the basics around, are we even, able to accurately capture and reflect and report the emissions that are already happening? Like, that feels like a pretty solid basis from which to start. So globally, given Biden is no longer the president of the US, and we have a very differently postured government over there, I'd say, there hasn't been that leadership at a global level for some of that. And then therefore countries like Australia that did sign up to that global methane pledge like there just hasn't been really as much of an energy or driver behind wanting to put more meat on the bones for that in a domestic context. So really commend the CCA for sort of seeking to really kickstart and drive that conversation. And to my mind, they're doing it in a very practical and pragmatic way. So the paper, and I think it's sort of fair to say, it's a consultation paper. It's a reasonably quick read, and much of it is sort of about seeking to ask questions and very much in kind of information gathering mode, rather than suggesting a full, a sort of comprehensive suite of solutions across the board. A lot more questions and answers in this paper as appropriate. But they do kind of go through the paper and clearly kind of making the case for why do we need to focus on this as an issue. It has a really significant near-term impact on warming, over 12 years, much, much stronger than carbon dioxide, over 80 times the global warming potential of CO2. So when we're talking about the ability to bend the curve or to limit this period of overshoot that we're clearly heading for, as sort of regards efforts to limit global warming to as close to 1.5 as possible, a concerted focus on methane in the short term is going to pay more dividends over that time, and then obviously consequently into the medium term. And so the paper does a really good job of kind of breaking down where methane emissions kind of occur across the economy. As you'd expect, the big ticket or the biggest kind of source of those emissions is in the agricultural sector, and a lot of that is from cows burping and other livestock related emissions.
That's 49% of Australia's total methane emissions from human-induced activities.
Yeah, it's a really big source. They also say though that that I guess the sort of characterization is there's not as much low-hanging fruit to be got in that sector in the very near term as compared with where they do posit that there is more that can be done in the here and now, and that is on the fugitive methane or emissions associated with the fossil fuel industry.
Just on that point, because this is not the focus of this paper, and very reasonable for the CCA to kind of decide the scope of what it wants to take on. But I wonder if they'll ever seriously take on the dietary elements of this, because there obviously are things that could be done in that space. But I think that the CCA has decided that that is not a realistic sort of near-term pathway for any significant abatement, and they're not going near it just yet. But I wonder if they will one day.
I mean, I hope they do. But as I say, you do have to start somewhere, and I think it's also instructive to point to the other big ticket policy review, which they note in the safeguard this year as very connected to the to the concept and reality of methane or fugitive methane in coal mining and oil and gas. Those things are very connected, and so there's a near-term opportunity in revisiting the policy settings attached to safeguard and other complementary stuff around that. There's already an opportunity to lean into there. I do wonder, and I certainly don't presume to speak for CCA on this, maybe they'll send us a note or something in response. I do wonder whether this is the kind of political or kind of climate in which to have a productive conversation around people eating less meat or or that's your sort of demand side lever on that side. Also some really exciting stuff on the technology front around kind of, stem cell based production or other plant based or, just sort of substitutes effectively that don't involve real animals burping and farting and stuff in fields. That's exciting.
I think people are still trying to come up with a terminology that will combine not befuddling people and not repulsing people for these alternative proteins. Precision fermentation, I think, is a bit more on the befuddling side. But yeah, there is cool stuff, even if it does involve forms of behaviour change. And I think it would be super interesting. It also clearly is super duper sensitive. But we might come to this. One of the, is it an argument? Is it a whinge? Responses that you may well get from the industries that are the focus of this review is, but why are you focusing on us? Why pick on us? Look at them in farming. They're so much bigger than us. Go bother them. And having a, well, you're easier to pick on response is true, but not very satisfying.
And I don't need to, I would say I don't think you need to make the argument that they're easier to pick on. I do think in many cases there are just readier interventions that are maybe either already in place in other jurisdictions around the world when it comes to methane abatement in coal and gas mining, things like ventilated air methane technology, just to pick one example. But also just sort of some very sensible stuff around how we measure and report methane in a way that appropriately focuses attention of key stakeholders on its near-term impacts and therefore the opportunities associated with it. So look, I am not going to venture too much of speculation on it, but I would understand why they've chosen not to focus in on agriculture in the first instance, given Safeguard Review is coming up, given, there are just sort of other really good efforts that are gathering momentum a bit more broadly, and you could say Australia's, if not behind, there's an opportunity to align with some really good practice happening elsewhere. That includes reporting frameworks, which I'm sure we're going to get stuck into here.
In the part of this paper that is reviewing the facts, was there anything in there about the sources of methane, the trends in methane? Was there anything in there that was a surprise to either of you? As people in maybe the top 1% of Australian cognoscenti of methane-related issues?
I would say person. I'm adjacent to the top 1%.
Look, I think you are underestimating. I think you have too much confidence in the methane knowledge of the bottom 99%. You have many, many other things to focus on.
Look, I think I was probably, I guess I hadn't paid as much attention to this split between open cut coal mining versus underground coal mining, and open cut coal mining is a bigger problem, and it's also a little it's a harder issue to solve for in some sense. So there's that. I mean, I guess I hadn't looked at, there's a neat diagram on one of the first pages that looks at sort of methane sources and, it includes kind of more natural sources around wetlands and inland freshwaters and stuff like that as a significant source of methane, which is never talked about, of makes like perfect sense. But I guess it's sort of, it's relevant to the conversation which tends to happen completely elsewhere around blue carbon and those those kinds of markets. Like, as I said, this issue is fragmented across so many different sectors and interest groups. I think it has really then suffered for lack of a kind of strategic focus because of that. So when you look at the sort of full suite of the sources of emissions, to me, it makes pretty good sense if you don't have a kind of clear target or mandate or strategy around it, why policy-making efforts have been disconnected or not particularly effective up till now was maybe my take out. I don't know if anything had jumped out to you, Tennant.
Well, the bit that I hadn't understood previously was just how dominant within the fossil methane space in Australia, just how dominant coal mines of all sorts were. Gas gets a lot of focus in broader climate policy because of the carbon dioxide emissions associated with the burning of so much gas, both for use here and in the process of exporting it. The leakage, even though that sector is so large, the leakage of methane from it, at least based on the data that is currently able to be gathered or estimated, and this review is not itself about improving that data. There's separate processes underway, which are pretty interesting for improving that. But for this from this data set, coal is more than 70%.
It's 76% or something.
Yeah,
it's a lot,
which is huge. And that split between the underground coal mines, which are more methane intensive, and the open cut mines, which are more numerous now and have been growing their output while underground has been declining a little. That is interesting too. And I know that there's lots of within the discourse around fear of underestimation of methane emissions, open cut coal mine emissions are the focus for a lot of that argument. But the basic reason for thinking that there's less methane emissions per mine or per unit of coal extracted from those open cut ones is that they are at shallower depths. If they weren't at shallower depths, you wouldn't mine them open cut. And at those shallow depths, they will already have lost most of the methane originally associated with the coal as it formed. That I hadn't considered all of that in sufficient detail before because I'm in the 99th percentile, not the 99.99th percentile.
Also, just on the coal, the contribution of coal mines that are no longer operating and
decommissioned ones. Yep.
Yes, and properly sealing those mines so they don't continue to leak methane. Seems like that could be a pretty rich area for methane reduction, but begs the question whose job it is to go and do that, right?
Yeah, 100%. So I think, whilst before you scratch the surface on all this delicious detail, you might have been asking, why not focus on agriculture? But you scratch the surface and it's like, well, fuck, if these, decommissioned mines are leaking methane and there are fixes to sealing that up, that feels like the sort of low-hanging fruit we should get onto. I'm really fired up, sorry.
Can I just, I'm going to take another sip of my cup of tea and ask you, Frankie, to explain to our listeners why the difference between GWP 20 and GWP 100 is so significant in this policy area.
Oh, my God. See you next week.
and then I'll be grumpy about it. So watch out, Frankie.
Oh, I realise
Luke can have even more sips of tea.
we're not going to like GWP Star, are we? Don't do that.
Not in this one, no, because that would only be relevant if we were... Well, that would be most relevant if we were talking about ag methane, I reckon.
Yeah.
I think it's worth unpacking because I think the CCA reckons it's quite significant from a policy perspective.
It is. And spoiler alert, I think it is too. And so do a lot of stakeholders I've been talking to about this. The global climate policy infrastructure architecture at the UNFCCC, its expert advisory kind of body in the IPCC. Oh my gosh, it's just sort of too many acronyms. I'm not going to spell them all out. You guys know who we're talking about here. All like global reporting is underpinned by referencing a 100-year global warming potential. So effectively calibrating or sort of representing the impacts of all greenhouse gases on a 100-year time frame. Now, for methane, there is a very strong case I think you can make that's on its own not an appropriate reflection of the near-term impact of methane emissions, which occur most acutely in the first 12 years that it exists in the atmosphere, and then sort of beyond that it breaks down quickly into carbon dioxide and water. So there has been a strong case being made in some places that to present methane emissions using both a 100-year and a 20-year global warming potential would be a more appropriate way of adding more information into the ecosystem on sort of appropriately kind of valuing or demonstrating its near-term impact. And if you were to kind of produce your pie charts on our emissions profile for methane, for a 100-year kind of global warming potential and a 20-year global warming potential, methane becomes close to half of Australia's emissions, basically. It's much more significant. And I think, obviously, the paper raises this issue and poses questions on, whether it would be appropriate to look at the use of a 20-year GWP in some contexts. Now, I think the reality is Australia is not through one policy review or through one regulatory measure, not going to replace the global reporting, the global standard.
Indeed, they're quite careful to say that is not what they're saying. They don't want to start messing with carbon accounting standards.
That's right. And I think you would find few supporters for that anyway. But requiring the disclosure of a 20-year GWP figure alongside a 100-year GWP figure is very possible and pretty easy to facilitate, given the Clean Energy Regulator obviously collects the relevant data already from regulated facilities, and it's it'd be a pretty simple calculation to also report a 20-year GWP alongside it. And that, I think, would provide sort of significant additional context and information around the relative attractiveness or potential in different policy interventions when it comes to addressing near-term warming impacts. So to my mind, there's a strong rationale for increasing transparency around both. I think ultimately what you would want to see happen is some sort of similar move at an international level where the IPCC would say, we've all been agreeing that this whole methane thing is a problem, and we need to drive some nearer term action where it makes sense to. Starting to look at reporting both in certain contexts would make a lot of sense.
So I think that was all well put. I just feel unable to resist putting some notes of caution and grumpiness into the space, because people are tempted, I think, in climate land to use these metrics in a tactical way and use different metrics in different contexts as part of trying to get an outcome. And like the crudest form of that is people who are upset about coal will use a GWP 100, and people who are upset about methane will use a GWP 20. But you actually want to be consistent if you have like one underlying concern, which is some version of the impacts of climate change on things that you hold dear. And you might prefer to have a 20-year horizon focus if you thought for one reason or another that the shorter term impacts were more important. So if you were particularly concerned about some form of tipping point where if a temperature outcome were hit for a period early on, there would be no going back for a particular Earth system that you are particularly concerned about. Maybe it is the Amazon rainforest, maybe it's the Great Barrier Reef, something that might or will experience a state change that is hard or impossible to reverse if temperatures hit a particular level. And then you're really focused on, do we hit that in the next couple of decades or more? And maybe then you're focused on these shorter term metrics. But if you're more focused on the whole of world impacts, those are largest in the long term from CO2 and certainly from the accumulation of all greenhouse gases and forcings over the next century and more. Sea level rise, that takes a long time to really accumulate, but it can become inevitable. The case for climate action to date has largely been built on the comparison of very long-term impacts with very long-term costs and benefits of climate action. And if you come down to a shorter-term focus, I think you do risk undercutting the whole logic of climate action. So anyway, I don't think any of that's definitive. I just think people should think carefully about why they are using an option or a metric. I'm sure there is a wholly coherent way to use this perspective, and having the additional information. I mean, what gets reported in the first place is tons of methane, and how that gets translated into comparisons. I think there should be multiple comparators. Luke, one of us mentioned GWP star, and we don't have time to fully go into that. No. Yeah. But without going fully into that, that's another take again that is more about whether, because they break down, whether methane emissions are stable and leading to a stable forcing, or rising or falling. And all of these tools have contexts in which they make sense and contexts in which they don't, and use your tools carefully.
I don't disagree with any of that. But I think though, where I would hope the thrust of this discussion goes is that allowing dual reporting and transparency across both, like gives you kind of the right tools to make the right decisions given the context. And I think, and everyone should be wary of cherry picking one or the other in given conversations. But as you noted, Tennant, like that tends to happen anyway. And so, like, I think what the paper is at pains to emphasize here is like, we're not seeing enough activity and kind of concerted focus. And just to sort of illustrate that point a little bit, and not to, like, I'm not intending this to be a huge kind of critique necessarily, but that there's no home or kind of responsibility for addressing methane emissions within the Australian government. Like there's not a part or a team within DQ that's got this, like, as a mandate, right? It exists across the various sort of sector plans acknowledged in some way, but there's not the governance or oversight with any sort of cohesive approach to this issue. And I think the benefit of getting a bit more transparency around where the biggest opportunities are, I think just it sort of creates just a much more sort of sensible basis for conversation around the kinds of interventions you would put in place. And certainly from an investor's perspective, like that helps. More transparency here helps kind of inform that decision making better, and that, those actors, you would like to think, are rational, want to make decisions based on the best information provided, and that should be the same for government. I would kind of note was, as I said, I don't. This is like, if we were to do something like that in Australia, like just allow for that dual reporting and the sort of obvious ways you might enable that with the CER's registry and things like that. It would see it sort of keeping, like, I think the EU's methane regulation talks about the need to report both a 20-year and a 100-year time horizon. There's some other work happening in other places, but the EU is probably setting the standard there in terms of that leading practice. So it's certainly something that would sit in the easy, like pretty easy to do, and pretty no regrets kind of option. I don't know, how is that, Luke? We went long on that.
I think it's good.
You've finished 2 cups of tea by now.
Are you refilling? What next?
Well, I suppose the point to draw our listeners' attention to is it's not just about transparency, it's also about, I guess, how companies calibrate their investment decisions across CO2 and methane, and also how policy acts as a driver for investment in methane, because you're effectively, what you're doing by, calculating methane with GWP20 is you're getting more bang for your buck in terms of abatement. If you calculate it that way, that could flow through in terms of policy and the recognition that companies get under tools like the safeguard mechanism for activities they undertake. Because, as you said, Frankie, the underlying thesis here is there's a lot of what appear to be really sensible and straightforward methane abatement opportunities that aren't getting addressed. If I'd have one, going to your point around picking the metric that kind of, gets the outcome, I suppose that one could argue that the CCA has glommed on to GWP 20 and elevating that because there's all this methane abatement that's not happening. So they've identified the issue. They would like to address the issue. GWP 20 could be a pathway for addressing that issue rather than that being, necessarily the best metric.
Yeah, I think you would firmly put it in the bucket of enabling, measures. to enable better decision making by private sector actors. I would say, though, even I think companies like Woodside use a 20-year GWP for internal business cases. Like, it's not like that isn't being used in some places privately, but like then when it, when the implications are for sort of policy making context, there's not that equivalence in the information and therefore the decision making. I mean, other things I would note here, and like, we've talked about, I mean, there's just sort of lots of things you might do across the board. I don't want to sort of quickly kind of do a bit of a running checklist, but it is worth noting a couple of other things in that vein that go to better transparency and sort of accuracy in reporting. There are a couple of important initiatives at a global level that could be adopted here more broadly. The first is the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, or OGMP 2.0. That's a United Nations Environment Program initiative. And that has 150 companies like concentrated in oil and gas, and many of those with operations in Australia have voluntarily joined that effort, and that is good kind of global best practice. So that's enhancing transparency and accuracy of reporting there. Similarly, you've got an Australia UNEP. IMEO, so the International Methane Emissions Observatory measurement study, and they're looking at a world-first study testing ground looking at satellite measurement and imagery, which has been like a bit of a like that sort of from time to time kind of comes up as a bit of a spicy topic, because you've also you do see environmental not-for-profits having invested in satellite tracking of methane emissions as well. It's a really good initiative also in open methane that looks to make much of that the information that is there from reputable sources sort of freely available. So there are questions that do need to be resolved here around like how accurate is the current system for measuring and then reporting the emissions that we've already got. And this sort of takes us into that expert panel territory, which CCA is not really engaging with, but notes that it's going on.
The UNEP work on testing a range of methane measurement techniques, that does sound super duper interesting. It does read like they're looking for a site at the moment where they can release some methane and then measure it. They will be doing some digging somewhere and having sensors on the ground and flights overhead and satellites even more overhead than that, and people with clipboards from Stanford University and a couple of other universities stroking their chins in excitement throughout. And we will get the maybe a paper that will be suitable for this very podcast in early 2028. So mark it in your calendar, Summerupperers.
Can't wait till 2028 for that. But regardless,
you could track down the site and go hang around at it and ask people questions, Frankie.
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say is, like, in the absence of a more definitive, like, this, thou shalt, measure and track kind of emissions this way, there does need to be a more concerted effort to reckon with, like, there are just different claims out there around what is being accurately kind of captured, reported, etc., and to sort of really put some rigor and standardization around how this is done, particularly in the context, and it should be very important from an Australian perspective, given, as we noted at the top of the episode, open cut, coal mining is where those emissions have been increasing more in recent years because we've got more open cut mines. You're seeing, not so much of that happened in underground coal mines, which are now also, in New South Wales at least, subject to new regulatory measures as well, which is looking at the imposition of ventilated air methane technology, or essentially trying to catch the fugitive methane through the ventilation systems underground, and then making sure the methane is burned or captured or repurpurposed.
Or decomposed using, I think UV, but oxidating that methane in a similar way, I guess, to what would happen in the atmosphere over 12 years, but rapidly. Yeah. With that one, like ventilation air methane management is something that the federal government gave a grant from the Powering the Regions Fund for a major demonstration at a real world coal mine.
I think it's
not so long ago.
I think it's Appin. Yep.
And it's a thing that people are excited about. I have also heard not so fast here, words from some people associated with the black coal sector saying, there's safety issues with deploying this. CCA seems to think the safety thing is fine. Do either of you know more about VAM safety? I mean, they're ventilating the methane so that the mines don't explode. You do want that ventilation to work.
Yeah.
But what's the deal?
Well, it's right to be sort of saying this needs to be done safely. Because I'm a methane nerd, I found myself in a professional context attending a roundtable co-hosted by the CSIRO last year with the US Clean Air Task Force on this very subject. And there were some representatives from coal mine companies in Australia. The Clean Air Task Force had brought out the technology providers who do VAM around the world. So the first thing to say is VAM is already established and used very broadly in the rest of the world. It's used in the US, it's used in South America. It's used in many, many other places. It hasn't been used in Australia because it hasn't been required to be used. It is, is my blunt kind of assessment. But I would also say, following that workshop and it's obviously been a longer run discussion, the EPA did seek to regulate for it. And so I think it is really important and good for Australia to focus in on and hold to very high safety standards. And I think I would also kind of venture to say that we do have very strong safety standards in Australia. I would say, though, the perspective of all of the other jurisdictions that are already doing this is those risks can be managed, and it's actually more a question of making sure Australian-based companies are appropriately familiarised with the technology, how you incorporate its design into existing mine site operations. It's more about kind of ensuring the safe adoption of that technology, which is widely used elsewhere. So I think there's probably a little bit of unnecessary fear-mongering going on there. And I would also kind of say, it's not going to be cheap to do this. So there are kind of genuine questions around if you're a coal mine operator and you operate on 5-year operating license kind of extensions. It's not a small investment to install this kind of technology. So I think the reason it hasn't happened is because there hasn't been a regulated requirement to do it, and the incentive such as it is in the safeguard mechanism, which imposes a marginal abatement cost of not very much, is not a sufficient kind of incentive to want to take on the CapEx investment of technology like that. So, more policy is required in that space. So much more that we could dive into in this paper, but if I could just end on guys, you all should care about this. So I want to make sure the CCA gets a lot of love for this consultation. And if you do, it's a really, I know it's, 47 pages or something, but a bunch of that is appendices. So you could flick through this after dinner one evening, folks. And if you even...
And why wouldn't you?
And exactly. Anyway, I look forward to fielding your questions via emails, social media, in the wild. But, have a look at it. Decide to...
Are you offering your services?
No.
Submission whisperer.
No, I'm definitely not doing that. Or else I'm just going to make it the fabulous person in my team whose job it is to look at our submission, being the wonderful Anna Hancock, who's embracing the obsession with methane with me over this next little while. It's very exciting.
So I think we can say... don't walk to climatechangeauthority.gov.au and get your submission in by the 7th of August.
You should care about this. Go have a look at it.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I would like to note that from the pit of despair in which hydrogen enthusiasts have found themselves thrashing about, weeping bitter tears, there emerges a green shoot. It has been advised to the market by Orica that they have made a final investment decision on their Hunter Valley Hydrogen Hub. They will be proceeding over the next couple of years with construction of electrolyzers and the integration of green hydrogen production to serve a portion of the needs for their ammonia manufacturing facility at Kooragang Island in New South Wales. That is going to replace or reduce the need for about 7.5% of the gas that facility would otherwise consume to make ammonia. So it is a start rather than an ending point. But it's a real thing that's actually been decided to be done and will start being done. I don't know if that means, it's time to go back to full hydrogen hysteria, but maybe buck up and keep trudging forward.
No, it's not time to go back to full hydrogen hysteria. But I think that a measured and clear-eyed view of hydrogen's role in critical points in industry is a good thing, and good on Orica for getting on with it.
With a hefty grant, I should add, from the Hydrogen Head Start program from the federal government. So that is business, government collaboration with the safeguard mechanism in the mix too.
All right, Frankie, what have you got?
I have. Well, I'd firstly love to shout out and say thanks to Rowan Morey from Springmount Advisory, who hit me up on text because he thought something he'd stumbled on in an IEA newsletter would be of interest to us. And I've been scrolling back through IEA newsletters past because his message wasn't specific about which particular newsletter he saw this in. So I haven't tracked down the original source for this. It was a really neat graph that had sort of showed the respective contributions to energy cost savings of different technologies, including renewables, nuclear, electrification, and efficiency. And efficiency, we're all not shocked at all, is in almost all jurisdictions the biggest contributor to energy cost reduction. So it sort of looked at China. This is like over the last decade, basically since 2015. You see sort of an almost equal chunk between efficiency and electrification from China, but that's sort of way more than renewables alone, and almost nothing from nuclear has contributed. In the EU, it's kind of renewables and efficiency kind of doing most of the heavy lifting. And sort of similar across, I'd say, sort of Southeast Asia, more gains from efficiency than renewables and nuclear in Japan and Korea. So I don't know, I just want to shout out it sort of remains the unsung hero in so many sort of energy policy discussions. And I thought it was really lovely that Rowan sought to highlight that for us. Knowing I think we'd be excited to see it. So I'll see if I can dig out a proper link to that for the show notes, because all I got is screenshots so far and I need to find the source. But really good to see it acknowledged and anyway, it would be interesting to see how the kind of the push on efficiency fares alongside the hot new thing in electrification, gathering some steam.
As we know, Frankie, efficiency and electrification, two great tastes.
That taste better
Tastes great together. All right. For my one more thing, I got to share a reflection, which is that I have recently returned from London Climate Action Week. Many exciting things happening over there, including the launch of the global electrification campaign that the EC has had a bit to do with, that we mentioned on last week's episode. And if you're interested in seeing one of the products of that important effort, you can now visit electrifynow.world, which is the HQ for all things electrification globally, henceforth. But actually what I wanted to highlight was one of the most striking things about being in London last week was the heat.
Yep.
Just an unprecedented heat wave hit London in the midst of London Climate Action Week. If one was writing a climate change themed novel, this would be a little bit too on the nose and would have attracted an editor's note. So you might want to be a little bit more subtle in terms of the atmospherics of what you're trying to convey. But I think we had 3 days in a row of record-breaking temperatures, as in the record got broken on Tuesday, then it got broken again on Wednesday, then it got broken again on Thursday. And I can report London not built for that sort of weather. There was plenty of rooms that I was in over the course of those 3 days which had sort of mobile air conditioning units in many of those rooms, including one that I sat in for an entire day. The room was being air conditioned by opening a window, sticking a tube out the window, letting all of the heat roll in through the window, and an epic battle of the air conditioner and the ambient heat pouring into the room ensued. This was not uncommon. Indeed, it was a feature of the apartment I was staying in, which caused me to take the cushions off the couch and stick the cushions in the window to provide some small modicum of thermal seal.
This was a source of intellectual as well as physical discomfort for all the efficiency knowers in London that week.
It was making me very sad. But the trains were shut down. Reports of stressed parents renting hotel rooms with air conditioning so that they could keep their babies safe, because they weren't able to maintain a safe temperature in their house. Very serious stuff. London, obviously, you know, a capital of a very rich nation, but the infrastructure not built for climate change. They're going to have a really big adaptation task to work through over coming years. Relatively well placed to do it compared to some other parts of the world, but sobering stuff as the great and the good grappled with all the big questions that are still to grapple with when it comes to tackling climate change.
And a weird, like, I mean, I don't know if we touched on this together, but it's also become a political flashpoint in France as well, with the sort of far right Marine Le Pen's party kind of starting to run on a platform of we will air condition everything if we get into power, and then the kind of counter movement to that, trying to go passive design, like we can do it, and like it's just, anyway, it's wild that that air conditioning is at the forefront of a national debate, but I did hear it's been very hot.
The centrist position, the everyone can compromise and win, it surely is, well, reverse cycle air conditioners are good for heating and cooling. And what do we need reverse cycle air conditioners for? We've got gas view of parts of European debate in recent years. Well, they've got an insight into the value of the other side of the cycle.
Indeed. All right, we are almost done. But every fortnight after the show, we record a bonus episode called There Is Too Much, in which we put our feet up on the desk, grab a drink and cover something we didn't have time for on the main show. Tennant, what are we reflecting on this week?
Before you, Luke, were in London, you were in Germany, and so was I. And while there, we learnt stuff about the state of industrial energy transition in Germany, about the state of the sleep patterns and anxiety levels of industry and policymakers in Germany. It was full of insights and stunning revelations, and we will exclusively share those revelations on the other side of the paywall to super Summerupperers who will be worded up on Germany. And I don't know, maybe a bonus thought or two on London if you feel generous, Luke.
So run, don't walk to letmesumup.net. You can navigate your way to the support LMSU tab at the top of the page and avail yourself of that sweet, sweet boko. Frankie, you like promoting things. What would you like to promote today?
I haven't prepared a shout out. And I've been...
You don't have to shout anything out.
No, but
you could shout us out.
You could promote the value of your friends.
No, I liked the pivot that I was on. People seem to have enjoyed me highlighting the work of others, but I've been so bloody head down, bum up in some stuff that...
I think you should promote yourself and your industriousness.
Probably.
This week, I'd like to shout out me.
All right, that is our show. This podcast was edited by Energy Professional Podcast Strategy.
The heat is on, Frankie.
In your studio.
You can't do that. Oh, my God.
For Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid.
How dare you?
I'm Luke Menzel.
Oh, no.
Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Or will you?
Frankie, it's 5:24.
Okay.